Subscribe or they will haunt you.
Subway workers, tunnel rats, and explorers of Reddit, what's your scariest, unexplained true story of the underground? I used to wander the old abandoned mines, cabins and grounds of Montana, areas people hadn't been in at least 3 decades. I knew every cabin too. I knew people who'd been there decades prior when there were still crazy old gold-panning loony types who'd never given up hope of the big find. I remember one story my father has with one of those people. My father and his brother were looking in this one area and a shot went over their heads. My father and uncle froze and said they were just hiking. The old man said they were trying to steal, and my father said who his grandmother was, who lived on the mountain since the early 60s. The old man then stopped, said to thank their mother for feeding him when he was starving one winter, but that he wasn't taking visitors that day and to get lost. About a decade ago my father and I found the dilapidated cabin that man was in by chance wandering randomly through the woods. It was really hard to find and we had just barely come across it. Everything that old man had was still there. The roof was partially caved in. Pots and pans were still on the stove like he had died in there or nearby. There was no body though. Just everything was there, covered in decades of normal decay, frozen in time, tools and all. It was a museum 100 years in the past, but only my father and I knew how to visit it. The old man must have died over 30 years ago at least, since he was so old when my father saw him. That cabin was bulldozed to build millionaire cabins 8 or so years ago, along with dozens of other secret museums of the gold rush past. I used to know every secret path of that woods for miles in every direction to every secret cabin, game trail and serene natural rest stop. It is all now empty cul-de-sacs with no cabins, because the money stream ran dry. I think that is the scariest and saddest part, frankly. I once was alone at Moorgate Station in London after staying for a few after-work drinks with my buddy who also works in Central. It was around 10 p.m. so I left the pub and walked to the station and found I had missed the previous train by about 5 minutes. Moorgate Station is an underground station, but the overground trains depart and terminate there. The train that I needed to catch always departs from one of 2 platforms that are in their individual tunnels adjacent to one another, but accessible by foot as they are connected by paths that connect the platforms every 15 feet or so. I was sat on the bench right at the end near where the front of the train would be when departing. As I sat there I saw some movement in the corner of my eye, so I turned and stared to see just a regular guy dressed in dark clothing come through from the other platform passage about 10 meters from me and thought nothing of it. He went by the track, started down, backed away and ran back through the passage to the other platform. I thought to myself that was weird and quickly got up to follow him and find out why he was running, if he was okay. I was no more than 5 seconds behind him and the exit entry to the platform is right by the other end, which was a good 150 meters or so away. As I go through the passage to the other platform I looked to see no one there. I then went back to the other platform and again I was the only one there apart from a woman who just reached the bottom of the escalator to the platform entrance right down the other end. It was something I couldn't explain and I was sure I couldn't recall any footsteps. That made it even weirder. London is an old place and has a lot of history, so not sure if there was an event that could give reasoning to what I experienced, but it's a memory that will always stick with me. Well, not unexplained as the explanation is I am an idiot, but definitely scary. Houston is crisscrossed with bayous because it's a swamp that needs to be drained a lot. There are these gigantic tunnels that lead to the bayous and collect water from the storm drains. When we were kids, these were great to explore. We'd make maps about how to get from one area to another using these tunnels. Well, we set aside one Saturday to try to make all the way to a mall a couple miles away from the starting point. Our hand-drawn map was about halfway done. We got lost, and then, as it is wont to do in Houston in the summer, It started pouring down rain. This happened before, but we were usually close to an exit. Not this time. It kept raining. The water got high enough that the current knocked us over. Eventually we got spread out into a bayou from a tunnel we had never even explored. After finally getting out of the bayou and getting back to safety, we realized we were almost a mile from where we started. Recently, I was visiting NYC and stayed in a hotel inside the city. It was a fairly nice place, but it was also a pretty old building that was not built with the intention of it getting so much use. For example, there were only 2 tiny elevators available for guests, and the hotel was at least 15-20 floors. The wait for elevators took so long that I decided I'd use the stairs. For some reason, there were 4-5 stairwells in the building, accessible from each floor, and most wound up in different parts of the lobby. I remembered using one of them the day before, and I thought it was stairwell D, so I took it. After descending for a while, I passed level 2. The next exit wasn't marked, but I thought it had to be level 1. I went through the exit door and found myself in an unfamiliar hallway with a very low ceiling. It could only have been about 7 feet, and sparse lighting. It wasn't eerie, but it definitely didn't look like it was intended for guests. Still, a little curious, I decided to check it out and see if I could find the lobby. I walked for a minute down a long hallway with a kind of dirty stone floor and some industrial double doors. There didn't seem to be anyone around, and it was pretty quiet. I rounded the corner, and to my immediate right was this big window set into the wall. Through it was a clean white room that reminded me a little of my high school's cafeteria. I remember thinking that, but I'm not sure exactly why. There was also a man, sitting and looking at his phone. He must have been about 5 feet away from me, and only the window separated us. He saw me and looked a little startled. I waved and was about to ask where the lobby was, but he quickly pointed for me to turn back. Neither of us ever said a word. It was just the weirdest experience being in such a silent, dirty place and then seeing a modern room with a person. I speed walked out and took the elevator. In retrospect, I probably just stumbled into some storage area under the lobby. It definitely wasn't the same level, but it was the strangest discovery, and I like to imagine what could have gone on down there and why I wasn't allowed to be there. Edit: I definitely agree that there is a rational, boring explanation for this. I just thought it was an interesting story. I grew up in Frederick, Maryland. Back in the mid-90s to early 2000s when I was a teenager, the city still had a very Rust Belt vibe before its fairly recent revival into a hipster-infested douche mecca. It had a fairly large blue-collar presence, particularly along the city's open-air drainage canal, which back when I was growing up was flanked on both sides by tons of abandoned and/or condemned buildings, both residential and industrial. Now it's all sushi fusion joints, hilariously overpriced condos, and vintage thrift shops like every other city on the East Coast. Anyway, back then we would roam around the city and break into abandoned buildings for fun. Sometimes we'd vandalize the place, but usually we were just exploring and using them as a hangout spot where we could drink and smoke weed without having to worry about cops. There were a bunch of creepy moments, particularly when you'd break into a condemned house only to discover that one or more homeless people had set up in there. My city kind of had a reputation for having a lot of severely mentally ill homeless people back then. Paranoid schizophrenics and such, a bunch of whom I knew by name back then. One memory that stands out, though, was an abandoned house we broke into which had clearly been vacant for many years, with visible black mold growing on the walls. It was weird because it had clearly been occupied by a family previously, because all of their stuff was still there. Like the rapture happened and they just disappeared. Beds, dressers with clothes, family photos on the walls. All of that. We didn't dare open the fridge. It really seemed like for some reason the family drove away one day and just never returned. It was super creepy walking through their home with flashlights and just getting this rotted glimpse into their lives before whatever happened. Although it's technically not urban exploring, As a former electrician, I think I can still share one moment from a job I had to do about 13 years ago. Me and my job partner were called out to a larger restoration job that was being done to an older house from the early 1900s. The house was, until this point, a family-owned house which had 2 owners since it was built, and the last owner was an old lady who had passed away there whilst being the last person in her family line. Sad story on its own, and nobody could take over the house. So the house got auctioned to a younger couple that bought it for an insane amount of money due to how large the house was. But it was now time to get the old house up to modern standards, which included a completely new installation from scratch, as the old cables around the house were the type of cables that was insulated with black cotton and fastened with handcrafted wooden clamps. While working on the first floor was quite easy, as the entire installation process was made to fit inside the new wall frames that the carpenters were setting up. We eventually had to move on to the second floor and prepare for setting up a new intake from the attic, which would then pass down to the new main fuse box on the second floor. We opened the hatch to the attic, and while using the flashlight to look up there, we could surely see that the attic was very cramped, so the smallest of us would have to go up there to fix everything to get the intake cable settled while removing the old one. As you might guess, I was the smallest of us and had to do that shitty job of going up where nobody probably had been for many years. So I decided to grab a lunch break and mentally prepare myself for what I expected to become a pretty shit job. After eating, I grabbed my flashlight and tool belt and started climbing up the stairs. And while climbing upwards, I noticed that the smell that we thought was pretty much old people smell after they die was getting increasingly stronger. But I had to continue. So I got to the top and crawled myself onto something stable when I got up, while noticing that the smell up there was pretty damn bad. So I grabbed my flashlight to look around and get somewhat oriented about where to crawl. Looking forward, it seemed like a pretty straightforward route towards the intake point that I could see in the distance. But out of curiosity, I wondered if there were anything up there. So I looked to my right, only to light up 5 carcasses of what once was the old lady's cats that probably had died. One of them were more or less intact whilst being visibly partly eaten by various insects or whatever eats such stuff, while 2 of them were more or less just rotten dried skin and bones. At that moment I absolutely regretted my decision to eat lunch, as the sight of this, along with the realization about what I had smelled all along, was these dead cats, and immediately threw up on the spot before very swiftly noping the fuck out of there. After some talk back and forth, we came to the possibility that the old lady had been throwing her cats up there when they died. Oh, me by one. But we will never know for sure, since the lady had died. The new owners had no idea about this when buying the house, but our company ended up denying to continue the work until the attic had been cleaned appropriately. This apparently took them about 1 month to complete. I guess there are not many companies who wants to deal with that kind of nasty stuff, but my partner at work ended up finishing the work on the attic afterwards, as he felt kinda bad for me. In the end, I decided to not continue being an electrician anymore, as this was not work I really enjoyed doing, especially not after this event. Me and a few friends explored this abandoned quarry once. There was one main tunnel going back into a mountain with tons of straight offshoot tunnels and clearings intersecting it. We came to one of the cleared out areas far back into the mine. The entrance to the tunnel was out of sight, with no light other than our spotlights. Laying on some rocks at the bottom of the flooded, partially caved-in clearing was one of those old TVs that sit like a cabinet on the floor. At first we thought it was some kind of chest or crate, but when we put a spotlight on it and realized it was an old TV, it was definitely unsettling. The whole quarry had a creepy vibe to it, but the TV was just really out of place. I guess some of the miners had it running off a generator or something back in the day. Creepy nonetheless. So I've done a lot of things like this, and there is usually an explanation for anything that seems untoward. Disused mental hospitals, train tunnels, sewers, abandoned stations, utility tunnels, military installations, the lot. It's usually just your mind if you think something is weird. One story that springs to mind was being in a storm drain in London. The storm drains are generally dry, but there might be water elsewhere. The tunnels can stretch for miles at a time. We would always listen out for moving water and any changes in air pressure or temperature, just to know whether there was going to be any change in water level or something dumped into the tunnel further up the line. I was in this sewer and there was a massive gust of wind. No idea what caused it, but the chap I was with looked at me and we both just said, "We're leaving right now." We stopped up the tunnel and made our way out into a dry night. Something in that change of air pressure and temperature told us something, and I'm not sure what it was, but we both knew that leaving there and then was the right thing to do. I was in a house that the police confiscated from a biker gang. My job was to assess the damage for an insurance company. The walls were all painted white and the floor was sheets of plywood painted dark red. I was going around measuring each room, opening doors. No problem. I then opened the linen closet and it had deep scratch marks on the inside and dents on the back of the door like someone was trying to escape. The freaky part was straight ahead at my head level was a round red splatter pattern on the back wall that had been painted over with a coat of white paint. Freaked me the fuck out, like someone was trapped in there and then someone opened the door and shot them in the head. There used to be an abandoned rubber factory on the edge of my town before it was torn down a couple years back. I went there once and tried all the doors, but they were barred. But I did find a crack in the concrete wall around the back that was just big enough to slip through. The inside was really neat. There were abandoned boats that must have been in storage for decades there. A bunch of old conveyor belts and factory equipment. All kinds of drug paraphernalia. I found a random painting of Jesus in a makeshift shrine. But that's not the creepy part. I was walking around this abandoned factory at about 8 p.m. Just after dark. I look around for an hour or so, and aside from some old shit there's really nothing out of the ordinary. Then I hear music start playing, something sort of blues-y somewhere in the factory. I'm not easily scared, and I kind of wanted to figure out what sort of freak was listening to old records in an abandoned factory, because that's something I will do. I track down the noise after about 5-10 minutes, and it's in this room in the basement that has the doorway covered with a tarp. I go inside and the room is a huge contrast from the rest of the dingy, old factory. The walls were bright purple, and the room was warm like there was a space heater in it, whereas the rest of the factory was freezing. There's a cassette player on the floor playing a song which I later tracked down to be called Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. But I never found out what the other songs were, and a bunch of papers taped to the walls that all say, "She gotta run, she gotta run, she gotta run." If I were to guess, there were at least 100 sheets that said the exact same phrase, just plastered on the walls and laying on the floor. There was a chair that looked like it had been detached from a school desk in the corner, and a statue of an animal that was really badly chipped and burned, like someone was trying to destroy it. There was also a stack of VHS tapes that had the names of women on the sides. I only remember seeing Jessica on multiple, but there were a few other names. I left shortly after because I got worried whoever owned all this shit would come back and find me there, and I figured they were in the building with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it for a few weeks. I was convinced it was either a serial killer or some guy with a porn collection that he couldn't risk having at home, or something worse on the tapes, and went back with a friend. But when we got there they had already started demolishing the place and it was inaccessible. I'll always wonder what was on those tapes, but part of me is glad I don't know.